Hey guys, it's GirlGotGame, and these are my final thoughts on Taisho Alice, Heads and Tails. Now, before I go any further, this whole video is going to go into spoilers for both this fandisk and the original game, so if you haven't played either the original or the fandisk for yourself or watched my series, then please go and do so first. Now, with that out of the way, let's begin! I was really impressed by the variety of story in this fandisk. We had alternate points of view of the original game thanks to the Ryoushi and Wolf quote-unquote roots. We had full-on epilogue stories for each of the personalities, plus an AU extra world we didn't see in the original game, in the form of a school setting with our girl and all the personalities, but without any of the trauma from the first game. With the exception of a certain somebody, but we'll talk about that later. Starting with the writing, I'd say that while not as strong as in the original game, the writing was still really good, especially with the way characters interacted with each other. With the tone of this fandisk being more on the lighthearted side than the original game, we didn't really have as many crazy reveals this time around, but there were still a couple crazy revelations to be had. Also, the level of humor in this is at the same level, if not better, than in the first. There are so many ridiculous moments and statements that happen, and I laughed out loud several times while playing through this. There were, however, some negative aspects to the writing this time around, more so than in the first game, namely in Woolfe and Ryousi's roots. I'll talk more about some of those moments when I get into my ranking list, but in short, there are points throughout both of those roots where you can tell the writing is restricted by the original game story. The characters will be thinking about something in a logical way, but then their actions will be contrary to those thoughts, because otherwise it wouldn't sync up with the story that was already told. Sometimes the characters themselves will get frustrated at why they acted a certain way when they're aware in their mind that that was an awful way to handle things. Another thing that was disappointing is that even though there's a bunch of stories in this fandisk, the main star of the show, Alistair, is conspicuously missing a root of his own. At least in the original game we got a bit of story from his point of view, and I was disappointed we weren't able to get some insight from his point of view about his thoughts and feelings after the events of the original game. While we did get a little insight into this thanks to Woolfe and Ryoushi's roots, I'm still disappointed Alistair didn't get a root of his own, and it's so puzzling to me, because to me, Alistair is really the main character of this, and the original game and this fandisk wouldn't exist without him. So in conclusion, while the writing is definitely still excellent here, there were sadly also some frustrating and disappointing parts. Moving on to the art. A lot of the background and sprite art from the first game were reused here, which is to be expected, but we did also get quite a bit of new background and sprite art, especially during Ryoushi and Wolf's roots. And of course, we had some new gorgeous CGs as well. There weren't a ton, but definitely a decent amount, and once again they were evenly distributed between all the boys, which was very much appreciated. One of the biggest surprises was having all new outfits for Yura and the guys in Arisa Academy, and boy did they all look good. I was a big fan of those designs. And I'd be remiss to not mention one of the best additions to this fandisk, which is the addition of having Yura's sprite appear in the dialogue box for the Epilogue stories and Arisa Academy. It was so nice being able to see her expressions this time around. I definitely felt like it helped me connect to her more than I did in the first game. And it wasn't just her. Ryoushi and Wolf also had sprites in the dialogue boxes, and that was definitely much appreciated. I will say that the new art in this game is a little different stylistically from the rest of the art, but it's really quite subtle. I think overall they did a good job of blending the two styles and making it as close as possible though, so kudos for that. And then moving on to music, just like art, there was a lot of reused music from the first game. This was fine, as it definitely served as a connecting bridge between both games. There were one or two new songs added, one of which should have played way longer than it did. And yes, I'm talking about Snow White singing while Yura played the piano. I was so miffed we didn't get a longer version of that while playing, but I found the full version in the memory section, so I'm definitely using that in this video at some point, I promise. We also got a brand new opening song, which was a lot of fun and fit the lighthearted tone this fandisk mostly focuses on. I kind of wish they had done a new credits song as well, but considering we only had credits for a handful of endings, I can understand why they didn't bother. It just would have been nice to have, considering not much changed in the music department from the first game. Now, this would normally be the part of my review where I talk about my thoughts on the MC, but I really don't have much to add here that I didn't already talk and rant about ad nauseum in the first game as well as throughout this game. I guess if I were to give just a quick Cole's notes, I'd basically say my feelings about Yurika really haven't changed. Any version of Yurika that's not real-world version is still way better. In fact, this game did some favors for Gretel's Yurika, and she's probably ranked higher than the OG now at this point for me. What I can say after what I learned about her during this fandisk is I think I might actually dislike her more than I did originally. And I do apologize to the Yurika lovers out there, I really do. But seeing how controlling Yurika was of Ryoushi, Wolf, and Alistair, and that in spite of all her crappy actions, she got away basically scot-free is just so frustrating. I'm still not sure who I want to shake more, Yurika or the characters that continuously enable her behavior. But I'll restrain myself to that for now, because I will talk more about some of that later. As for the other Yurikas, the epilogue ones are still their unique selves, both for better and for worse. Plus, we also got introduced to a new Yurika in Arisa Academy, and she's a pretty good cookie overall. Yeah, she's got all the chaos and perfection of the other Yurikas because she's Yurika, but she is fairly subdued through all the routes and isn't as pushy as some of her other counterparts, and I liked her well enough. So, good job, Arisa Academy Yurika, for being better than your real-world counterpart. I know it's not a high bar to cross, but credit where credit's due. Okay. Now that I'm done ranting, after I said I wouldn't, let's rank these routes, shall we? My list will be a little different this time. I'll still have 3, but the first one will be focused on the epilogue stories for the guys. The second one will be ranking Ryoushi and Wolf's endings, and then the third one will be for Arisa Academy's routes. So, starting off with the epilogues, at the bottom of the list is shockingly not Gretel, if you can believe it. Sadly, Red Riding Hood has taken the new bottom spot in this particular list. Red's epilogue was very much in character for Red, which is to say it was chock full of innuendo and screaming bloody murder. I'll be honest in saying that's the main reason he's at the bottom here. While I'd say that those things are probably not as prevalent as they were in the original game, I can't confidently say that it's not due in major part to the fact that the length of these epilogue stories are quite a bit shorter than the original. That's not to say there weren't cute and funny moments here, because there definitely were. And Red has had some character development by being a lot more comfortable with Yurika's touch these days. This epilogue started with Red and Yurika getting caught in the rain and then having a bath together, which you just know is going to end well. That turned into a competition for the rest of the evening on which of them is the thirstiest, except that Red is too anxious to act on it, and then Yurika got mad at him for it. Now, the story does end with a sweet confession from Red to Yurika about how of course he wants to be with her physically, and surprisingly we have a fade to black, or maybe more accurately a scream to black. I'm not entirely convinced anything actually happened, but Red is very happy, and that's really all that matters. But anyways, this epilogue was just too cringy for my personal taste, and I was exhausted afterwards, so Red ends up here at the bottom this time around. After Red Riding Hood, I'd put Gretel, or maybe as he was better known in this epilogue, Gluttle. But yes, the gremlin managed to climb up one rank on this list at least. His epilogue was actually pretty hilarious. I was not expecting it to be so focused on Gretel despairing over gaining a little bit of weight and going through massive sugar withdrawal in his efforts to lose those few pounds, but it was great. I probably enjoyed myself laughing too much at his misery, if I'm being honest. But it wasn't just because his route was funny that I enjoyed it so much. Gretel had shown some really good character growth from his original route, which was lovely to see. While he slipped once or twice, for the most part he managed to call Yurika by her name and not sister, which was a huge relief. He also had some not too bad conversations with Ryoushi, so it was good to see that while their relationship isn't friendly yet still by any means, I think it's still slowly improving. Also, I thought the advanced reservation of Gretel painting Yurika's ring finger with his signature color was cute. Sure, a small part of me would have liked if he asked before painting her finger, but I'm going to let it slide because it was really a sweet moment and one that Yurika was more than okay with. I also really liked the conversation about the ribbon he had got for Yurika in the original game being locked away, and how he understood why she was doing it because he used to be like that. I thought it was a great moment to show Gretel's character growth, and I gotta say, I'm actually a little bit proud of him. His epilogue was a nice surprise, and I'm happy to bump him up a little on this list. Alright, up next I'm going to have to go with Alice. His afterstory was interesting, to say the least. I got a little sneak peek to what was coming with this route thanks to Wizard, so I wasn't totally caught unaware. The whole concept of the route wasn't a bad one. Yurika was having some insecurities about whether Alice had actually left his feelings for real-world child Yurika aside and actually fell for her, and I can understand why she'd feel that way. Alice is not exactly known for being forthcoming, shall we say, with expressions of any feelings other than sass. So, in order to help, the wizard changes her into the child version of herself, and off she runs to find her boy. Then what ensues is Alice doing an expert job of playing dumb and pretending that this isn't his Yurika, and half pretending / half actually having a thing for child Yurika. The amount of pedo accusations and jokes in this epilogue was absolutely crazy. Admittedly, it was all pretty hilarious, and I was taken out several times with laughter throughout. But it was also definitely uncomfortable too. What I did like is that we had world hopping happening here, which was a nice callback to his route in the first game. It was nice actually being along for the ride with Alice this time though, and also seeing all the other guys reacting to tiny Yurika was pretty great as well. Eventually, Alice finally admits to her that he knew it was his Yurika all along, and that he wants the full-size version of her back. My favorite part of his epilogue is from this point on, with him giving an epic speech to the wizard about how he's an idiot, and that Alice can tell the difference between all these different Yurikas, and he's truly fallen in love with his. Even after Wizard is an edgelord and summons all the other Yurikas in order to confuse Alice, Alice has zero problem picking out his correct one and is able to break the curse on Yurika with the classic cure of a fairy tale kiss. I was relieved that Alice made a point of kissing her big self once the curse was broken, because he's right that it would have been super weird if he had only kissed her small self. And his confession to her after she turned back was so sweet. And then of course, the icing on the cake, him picking her up for a bridal carry! How could I not love that? Especially when Yurika kept rambling her expressions of love to him when he so desperately wanted to put her down. That was just great. Honestly, if it wasn't for the weird pedo stuff throughout the epilogue, I think this would have ranked higher, but that aside, I did still enjoy this epilogue quite a bit. Coming up next is Snow White. His epilogue definitely had a distinct feeling that was different from the others. It was much more on the serious side and dealt with lingering trauma. We started off with Yurika and Snow getting caught in the rain and having to take refuge in an abandoned house that looked strangely familiar. There were some cute spoops in the beginning, as this place definitely gave off a haunted atmosphere, and Snow was every inch a fairy tale prince helping his girl out as best he could. As we go through the epilogue, we discover that the house was in fact the same one that Snow was living in with his mom and his root, but now filled with trash and completely dark, reflecting how his home with her was like in the real world, and the reason they couldn't leave is because Snow still had memories and feelings from that time of his life that he struggles to move on from. Snow and Yurika had one of my favorite conversations in the game about how it's not so easy to move on from trauma, and I loved that Yurika wasn't upset at Snow for trapping them in this nightmare-like place. She understood it wasn't something he wanted or caused, and she acknowledged to him that despite being in a dream world with his princess, those feelings of his are not going to disappear overnight, and that's okay. The illustration Yurika used of mud and snow was beautiful and so fitting for Snow White. I also loved that the rain that had been falling throughout the story changed to snow as Yurika helped him learn to accept those feelings and not be embarrassed or ashamed of them. I'd also be remiss to not mention one of my favorite scenes in this game, which was Yurika playing piano while Snow sang along. Boy truly has the voice of an angel, and that whole scene was hauntingly beautiful. And then, to wrap things off, Mom and Ryoushi come to the rescue of these two and get them home safe and sound. And another great moment came at the end of this, where Yurika's overly touchy brothers stormed in and got too close to Yurika until Snow shoved Gretel into a wall. How could I not love this epilogue just for that moment alone, right? But honestly, the more serious vibes of this epilogue fitting Snow's personality perfectly, as well as the whole theme of not being disheartened for still feeling the effects of trauma after receiving help and taking it one day at a time, was so beautiful. I enjoyed this epilogue immensely. And now we're hitting the top 3 for this list. At number 3, it's going to go to Cinderella. The focus of this epilogue was, not surprisingly, around money. Considering how that was the main thrust of the original route, it made sense. Both Cinderella and Eureka have been engaged for a while by this point, and Eureka is doing her darndest to be as frugal as possible to help Cinderella pay off these debts so that the two of them can get married debt-free. However, waiting for this long to get married and living so frugally has taken an understandable toll on the two. I think, out of all the epilogues, this was probably the most wholesome one. And I'll admit, I'm probably a little biased toward this because the whole shopping day with these two was so reminiscent of when I go shopping with my own hubby, so I had the derpiest grin on my face throughout most of this. As the story progresses, it quickly becomes obvious that Cinderella's planning something. Me and Eureka were both completely lost as to what it could be though, since these two were already engaged. However, after some unintended drunk Eureka shenanigans and her finally expressing her frustration at the lack of sleeping the two of them have done, Cinderella finally lets the cat out of the bag that he is proposing to her again, and this time he's handmade a ring out of glass, which I thought was the cutest, most romantic thing ever. I loved that. And he also acknowledges to Eureka that he's seen how hard she's been working and knows that it's been really tough for her that they haven't made progress on their wedding plans. And he's decided they should stop waiting to pay off these debts and go forward with getting married, and they'll work together towards paying these debts as a married couple instead of an engaged one. To which I say, hear hear! Huge fan of this plan. So yeah, the wholesomeness of this plus Cinderella continuing to be his absolutely wonderful self earned him an easy number 3 on my list. And then at number 2, I'm giving it to the Moon Prince Kaguya. This was another super cute epilogue. Eureka got really sick at the beginning of this, and because of this we found out that Kaguya is the absolute perfect boyfriend to take care of you when you're under the weather. He's super considerate, and it doesn't hurt that he's also super psychic. Those moments where he'd keep popping back into the room and reacting to Eureka's thoughts was hilarious. We also got a pretty spicy moment too, where Kaguya helped Eureka bathe and got her all flustered when he unhooked her bra. Boy's got some skills, to say the least. Thanks to Kaguya bullying Eureka into resting, which honestly I can relate to since I also need to be bullied into doing the same, she finally gets better and gets to meet all the temp workers that were hired at the cafe in her absence, which turns out to be all the other guys. Their interactions in the cafe were also really funny. Loved seeing those interactions between them. And thanks to all these beautiful boys that are starting to hang around now, it triggers a little something obsession something in Kagu Bear, who decides now's the time to take action. So, after a cute bike ride, he takes our girl to the lake at night under the full moon, and takes both me and Eureka completely by surprise, and proposes. And what an absolutely sweet proposal it was. Yes, some of the wording showed that Kaguya still got his obsessive tendencies, since part of the reason he's proposing is because he wants to make it very clear to the other guys that his girl's off limits. But it wouldn't really be Kaguya if he didn't still have his obsessive tendencies. And the rest of his proposal, where he talks about having Cinderella and or Snow White as his bondsmen since they're his family now, filled my heart with joy. I'm still so happy he found a family with those two, in addition to his love for Eureka. This was just overall another really enjoyable and solid epilogue, and I think I actually fell even more for Kaguya through this, so definitely a solid number 2 for me. And finally, at number 1, Mr. Wizard. I know, not a single one of you watching could have possibly guessed at that being the case, right? This boy's epilogue was everything I could have ever wanted. It really felt like a second part to his route more than an epilogue. We basically pick up where we left off in his route, with these two playing chess and Cat Eureka's finally close to getting her wish granted, until the wizard abruptly suggests an outing. What ensues is a lot of world jumping on a sorta kinda date, where we see how both Wizard and Eureka had a hand in influencing all the other epilogues. that in itself was really neat, and I loved how the bouquet of roses the two got in Red's epilogue world was used to solve problems in each of the following ones, until we were left with only one red rose for the ending of this. Anyway, as things are going along, the wizard just keeps getting more and more in his edgelord feels until it all comes to a head in Alice's world, where Yurika's had enough of his bitching and rightfully tells him off before running off for a brief vacation as Ryoshi's cat. In the meantime, the wizard gets some much-needed truth bombs dropped on him by both Alice and Wolf. His conversation with Wolf in particular was absolutely wonderful. They truly are two pining peas in a pod, and I found it wholesome that Wolf was the person Wizard unknowingly summoned when he needed to vent. It was a good choice, though, because Wolf truly was the perfect person to understand him, and gave such a good point about how the first person you fall in love with doesn't necessarily mean they're the best person for you, and you could be missing out on something truly special by continuing to hold on to someone who doesn't feel the same way about you. This all led to the best apology and confession scene ever back in Wizard's world, where he gives her the final rose and uses his magic to surround her in flowers. I absolutely loved the wording he used there of how all the flowers he surrounded her with were just illusions, but the one she had in her possession was the only real one and was truly precious, mirroring how he came to accept that the Yurika in his possession had also become real and precious to him, amongst all the other various Yurikas that exist. Plus, him also using chess symbolism to explain how she snuck across the board as a pawn, and before he realized it, she had promoted herself to his queen, was just everything. And then, of course, it all culminated in a sneak attack kiss from him that we never got for him in his original route. I may or may not still be doing my happy bean dance to this day. To say I was absolutely ecstatic with this epilogue is an understatement, so no surprises at all that he ended up being number one for me yet again on this list. So there you have it, my list for the boys' epilogues. And before I give my second list of the quote-unquote main roots of Ryoshi and Wolf, I'll just very briefly explain what I liked and didn't like during the lead up to their endings before ranking them. I'll start with Ryoshi, since I did his route first. I'll start off by saying that for the most part, my opinion of Ryoshi improved a lot thanks to his route. Thanks to Ryoshi, we got a much deeper look into the parenting he and Yurika received, though I'm hesitant to call any of that parenting. Their mom and dad really gave them a super cold upbringing and successfully screwed up both their kids, though I'll at least give dad half a cookie for at least acknowledging they were awful parents later on in the story. He only gets half a cookie, though, because he does nothing to try to fix anything, despite acknowledging this fact. Some people are not meant to be parents, and I'd say Ryoshi and Yurika's mom and dad definitely should not have been. Basically, from the time Yurika was born, Ryoshi developed an inferiority complex compared to her, and had a lot of jealousy towards her. Despite that, though, there were plenty of moments where his big brother instincts kicked in particular when he heard she was being bullied, and it was really wholesome to see that despite everything, Ryoshi is really a very good older brother, and I can't help but wonder if Yurika wouldn't have turned out a little better if the two of them had spent more time together as she was growing up. Something I really liked about Ryoshi's route was seeing the Snow White storyline from his perspective. Having Alice's sprite be present but talking to Snow really hit home for me more than anything, how it would be confusing to talk to another personality in the same body. Also, because of Yurika being an unreliable narrator in the first game, plus the fact that the love interests also had spotty memories, it was nice seeing these events from Ryoshi's perspective, who is a much better narrator than Yurika, and is also super observant. I felt like we learned more details about these events thanks to him, and it gave me a lot to chew on story-wise. I also absolutely adore just how much Snow White encouraged Ryoshi to make the choices he ended up making in the medical field. To see just how much he meant to Ryoshi really pulled at my heartstrings. One revelation I was not expecting from this route was learning that the same hunter who created the wizard personality was also the same one who helped Ryoshi when he was dealing with PTSD from Snow White, and that he ended up working for him and then also taking over from him later on. I am glad that we saw that that hunter did end up regretting what he'd done and realized he needed to quit before he caused further harm too. Unfortunately, it's around here though that the frustrations with the writing creep in, as I mentioned earlier in the video. It's really from this point on that the writing really struggles with how sane and rational they've made Ryoushi up to this point, and then the series of pretty bad decisions he ends up making. It all starts with suggesting to his dad that the family adopts Alistair. Considering Ryoushi had spent quite a bit of time up to this point realizing what a wreck his parents were as far as parenting is concerned, for him to suggest this was wild to me. Yes, granted the writing does a fairly good job of smoothing it over by explaining his thought process behind Alistair needs a stable environment to truly heal, but this ain't it, bro. I'm sorry, Ryoushi, I do love you, but this really wasn't the play. Plus, once Yura comes back on the scene, the amount of nonsense he lets her get away with, plus just all the crossing over sibling boundaries she does with him. Do I need to bring up the bed scene? Yeah, I got the impression she probably enjoyed doing Gretel's storyline when Alice was in his coma, let's just say that. But anyway, getting back to Ryoushi, consistently he sees all these red flags with her and doesn't act on it in any way. And when he does talk to her, it's usually after something catastrophic's happened. Also, the random dream interactions with Snow made zero sense. Did I love them? Absolutely. They were very touching, but there is absolutely zero explanation for how that was even possible. So, all this to say in short, while I really liked Ryoushi as a narrator and my opinion did improve of him thanks to this story, I was also frustrated by how his actions often contradicted his thought process, mostly due to the fact that he was constrained by the pre-existing story from the first game, so a lot of the new story beats that were trying to happen here just didn't mesh well. And then moving on to Wolf. I'll admit, I was worried when his route started off with Grandma giving the sage advice to baby Wolf about lying being good. But having that as the theme felt like a reference to the boy who cried wolf fable, which admittedly is a neat idea. Every single choice made by Wolf throughout his route was either him deciding whether to tell the truth or lie. What I found interesting about this is I noticed most of the truth options were pretty early in his story, and that about halfway through to the end is when he really starts lying. And if you choose to tell the truth more towards the end, it leads to what the game considers to be the bad endings. And I have to say, there was some truth in Grandma's words. While I don't condone lying under normal circumstances, there was the one conversation in particular with Alistair near the end that you have the option to lie to him. And I did personally agree with it because I didn't want to hurt Alistair any more than he already was hurting by that point. So I'm going to let Grandma's advice slide for that moment alone. Unlike Ryoshi's route that happened in more or less chronological order, we start off right from when Yura starts coming to Wolf's school, and then only later do we get the flashback sequence with Wolf and Baby Red. It was kind of nice seeing that from Wolf's perspective, honestly. Wolf really went through a lot of growth as a kid thanks to his friendship with Red, and it was nice to see how that developed. It was also crazy to learn that Wolf actually met up with Alistair's mom at one point as a kid. Was not expecting that. Plus, seeing the aftermath of what happened after Red's lie and how Wolf really held no animosity towards Red for any of that, and right up until the very minute that he had to leave with his parents, he was still waiting for his friend to show to say goodbye. It was really sad, and I could understand why it means so much to Wolf to look for his friend again all these years later. The flow of the story is also broken up by numerous daydream sequences throughout. I will admit that a lot of those daydreams of Wolf's were hilarious, but they were also super duper uncomfortable. Like, really uncomfortable. I was torn between feeling bad for Wolf for not even being able to safely fantasize about his dream girl, while also wanting to give him a bop on the head for dragging me along for that. Hands down, the best part of Wolf's route is his friendship with Alistair. While Wolf only really started hanging out with Alistair out of hope of meeting up with Blondie again, while also being able to have an in with Yura, seeing it genuinely develop into a healthy relationship for Alistair was delightful. I especially loved that Alistair felt comfortable enough with Wolf to ask him for advice. In particular, the moment he talks to Wolf about what happened with all the wizard shenanigans is something I was not prepared for but absolutely loved. Something Alistair desperately needed through all this was someone he could trust, and finding out he trusted Wolf with talking about something as effed up as that warmed my heart. Now if only Yura could have kept herself removed from this entire story so these two bros could have been together instead, honestly. There were so many times she either butted her way into their hangouts or separated these two, while also being just the worst by enabling Wolf's crush for her and using it against him time and time again. Wolf's route probably did even less favors for Yurika than Ryoshi's did, which is impressive, honestly. But ignoring her and focusing on Wolf, his route just made me feel even more bad for him than I already did. And despite his 12-year-old boy fantasies, I did come to admire his character and just how wonderful a friend he is. He's truly too good for this world and deserves someone way better than Yurika. And maybe he and Alistair can move in together far away from her, because I think that'd be pretty dope, honestly. And now finally moving on to the actual ends of these routes. At the bottom, it's an easy pick for me, is Ryoshi's Blurred Lines ending. I feel like not a huge explanation is needed here, but suffice to say, I wasn't a fan of the siblings getting even more inappropriately closer than they already had been behaving throughout Ryoshi's route as it was. Usually Ryoshi had some sense to make an attempt at rebuffing Yurika's crazy inappropriate overtures. Yes, he does then usually take the path of least resistance and just lets her do whatever she wants, but in this ending he's definitely playing into it himself. I mean, who hears about a romantic restaurant and instead of taking out one of the many nurses interested in him, suggests it to his little sister? What the actual heck, Ryoshi? The only thing good about this end is it sounds like Alistair's been distancing himself from Yurika and spending more time with Wolf, which is part of the reason why she's spending the night even more with her brother than she already was. But yeah, other than that, I feel the ending's pretty self-explanatory, and this was an easy bottom choice for this list. Next on this list would be Wolf's The Prince and the Wolf ending. When I say this ending made my soul leave my body, I definitely feel like this ending was connected to Ryoshi's Blurred Line ending, with both Alistair and Wolf having a wild conversation about how they're both in love with her and that they view each other as rivals, but also like the other enough to the point that they totally understand why Yurika would pick them. But the real crazy part of this whole conversation was them talking about how it was more likely that Yurika wouldn't end up with either of them and end up with, and I still can't believe I'm saying this, her brother Ryoshi. Coming to this realization results in Wolf and Alistair coming to a truce to fight off this competitor. Despite the absolutely gorgeous final CG for this ending, it was such a wacky end, and I think I'm still recovering from the nonsense of it all, so this is a good spot for it on the list. After that, I would put Ryoshi's My Little Troublemaker end. This ending had a little smidgen less flirting going on between brother and sister than the other one, which helped this ending to get a higher ranking from me. I think Ryoshi did a better job of pulling away from Yurika's influence and having a healthier boundary between them. Not 100% healthy, because these siblings are definitely still dysfunctional by the end, but definitely better than the last two endings I discussed. And the final talk between them while he gives her a piggyback ride was overall pretty wholesome, so I'll happily take it. At number 2, I'd probably put Wolf's I'm Sorry ending. Yes, the technically only bad ending in this fandisk is at number 2 for me. True, the ending itself is sad for our boy. Despite knowing what answer he'll receive from Yurika, he decides he needs to confront his feelings and confess them properly to her. He can't go on living the lie as just her friend and keep supporting her schemes. I was so proud of Wolf in this ending, honestly. Finding the courage to go through with it would not have been easy by any means. While I'm not convinced by Yurika's tears, it was pretty satisfying hearing her finally confess to, or at least acknowledge some of the crap she pulled on Wolf. It would have been more satisfying if Wolf didn't downplay it, but boy was still deep in his blind love for her in that moment, so I won't hold it too much against him. Regardless though, this felt like the only real kind of consequences that Yurika may have faced. It's nowhere near enough, but it did feel a little cathartic that she lost something here, and that something was a good man and a good friend. Would it be delusional on my part to hope that that experience might actually get her to think more about the consequences her actions have? It probably is, but I'd say at least the possibility has the greatest chance of happening here in this ending. And then moving on from Wolf's confession, I loved that he went and talked to Alistair about confessing to her too and didn't just disappear from his life after getting rejected by Yurika. Wolf really showed how much he respected and cared for Alistair by talking to him after that. He's truly a very good dude. I'd argue this was probably the best ending for Wolf's future. While he's going to go through an awful time waiting for his broken heart to heal, he at least has started the tough process. And if he does decide he wants to reach out to Yurika and Alistair again, he'll be in a much better space to legitimately be their friends without any of the painful hidden feelings that are present there in the other endings. Though I'll be honest, as I said earlier, I hope Alistair ditches Yurika's butt and seeks out Wolf after some time and they go rent an apartment or something. That would be my ideal happy ending. And finally, at number 1, I'm going with Wolf's The Boy Who Cried Wolf. I was torn between this and the I'm sorry ending. While I didn't like that Yurika didn't have to deal with any consequences from her actions, what I did love is the welcome home party for Alistair. I was thrilled to see that Wolf had invited his friends and how accepting and welcoming they were to Alistair. It's wonderful to know that Alistair's friendship circle is growing. This can only help him continue his journey of healing. And the final conversation between Alistair and Wolf, where Alistair talks about wanting to go and explore new places now after his experiences while in a coma, was wonderful to hear about. Of course, this wholesomeness was interrupted by Yurika, who couldn't bear to not be the center of attention for 5 minutes, but it was a really funny and cute end, with the 3 of them sitting together and declaring their love for each other as friends. It was a nice light-hearted ending, so it ended up winning the number 1 spot for me here. And with another list down, that means it's time for my 3rd list, which is the Arisa Academy routes. At the bottom, everyone's favorite gremlin returns to take his bottom spot once again. This boy had the chance at a fresh new start, but even in this universe where he doesn't have memories of his trauma, he still can't let go of his sister fetish, and so I gotta go through that joy again one last time. At the very least, though, there were no cages, unless you count the one incident in the kitchen trailer, and no talk of devouring either, thankfully. This boy did have the gall to put alcohol in a cake to get Yurika drunk, but that backfired spectacularly on him, and he ended up being affected instead. It really should have backfired more than that, though, with Yurika getting away from this guy, because that in itself is such a huge red flag on this pile of red flags that Gretel is inundated by. However, she doesn't, and so we continue on. Dealing with Gretel is always rather tiring, as he's constantly grumpy towards everyone and everything that isn't dessert or sister, and he's also constantly bullying Yurika into doing things like when he got her to dress up for his birthday and do a bunch of weird sister fetish things for him. But I will say that Gretel did at least have some character development. It was really rushed development due to how short these routes are, but he did actually give up on calling Yurika's sister during his confession under the tree, which was a huge surprise to me. I think he had an easier time of giving that up than his OG counterpart, so good job to him for that at least. He also had a pretty cute confession to her, if I'm being honest. I love that he didn't know about the school legend until she told him, and then once he found out, he beelined for that tree. The Christmas date was also really cute, and I love the barrette he picked out for her. He's got some good taste in gifts, I'll give him that. But overall, I didn't really buy Yurika actually being romantically interested in Gretel, at least in comparison with the other guys. Also, he's still the green gremlin, and with all his red flags, he's more than secured his bottom of the list spot once and for all. Next up is Red Riding Hood. Here, Red's a biology professor, which is honestly a great position for him, and he's as dedicated to his role here in the school as he was to his policeman persona in the original game. The other similarity of him having nosebleeds whenever something potentially lewd is said or done, I could have done without, though. Thankfully, at least both the lewd comments and nosebleeds were definitely less common than they were in the original game. Another connection that was kinda cute was him being a protector of Yurika during the Culture Festival in particular. I liked that callback a lot, and there were no hidden agendas this time around either, which was nice. Red had a bunch of cute and adorable moments this time around, such as him practicing his superhero poses while he's gardening. Also, him adopting a cat was super cute. Can't say the same about his choice of name for that cat, but I love the idea of this wolf boy having a kitten he takes care of. There was also the really funny and wholesome scene of him pretending Yurika was a boulder so that he could carry her home when she sprained her ankle. The cute moments aside, these two really have the same problem they have in the original, which is to say, I don't think they really make a good couple. While, yes, Red does need someone to be pushy when it comes to pursuing romance, Yurika is way too pushy and goes past too many boundaries. Also, I'll admit I was a wee bit miffed at this boy for ragging on how Cinderella sets a horrible example as a teacher, When Cinderella at least had the control to wait a year for this girl to graduate properly, and Red had no self-control about that whatsoever, and didn't even consider that to be an issue. Moving on. After him, I'd put Snow White. I really liked this route because we get all the amazing roasts from him that I love, but without the trauma he was going through in the original route. So he doesn't just up and disappear all the time, and he's much more willing to spend time with our girl. Snow still has a spot he doesn't really want to leave though, which is the infirmary this time around, so that's usually where we spend our time with him instead of the lake. At least in the infirmary, he gets to spend time with Ryoushi, whenever he's actually working, which seems to be almost never. Seriously, what is that boy up to most of the time? But speaking of Ryoushi, it was nice seeing him more involved in this route and getting some more interaction between him and Snow. I could have done without Yurika's occasional pushing of the brother-sister line again, but it wasn't too egregious this time around, so I'll let it slide. And as for Snow and Yurika's relationship, I thought it was cute that they basically started their own book club and grew closer through that. My favorite part of the route probably would be when Yurika recommended her favorite book to Snow, and while he was reading it, he actually left the infirmary to go and find her because the characters reminded him of him and her, and he was affected by worrying about her also disappearing like the character in the story did, so he tracked her down because he needed some reassurance from her. I can relate to that a ton, and it was a really cute moment from Snow. And of course, the ending of him totally not falling for her pretending to sleep and going in for the sneak attack kiss is so in character for his bold personality that we really got to see at the end of his original route too. The only thing I was surprised about with this route is that Snow's mom didn't show up at all. I thought for sure she'd cameo here at least a little bit, and considering she does show up in Wizard's route of all places, I'm really surprised she didn't feature in at least one scene with Snow. The main thing that probably holds Snow back from ranking higher for me on this list is pretty much because of the same feeling I had in his original route, in that it's pretty obvious why Snow falls for Yurika, and his feelings are very obvious, but I don't really get the sense from Yurika how she falls for Snow. Once again, she acknowledges his beauty, but without the fairy tale prince thing going on with her here like in the original, I don't know how much I buy into her feelings for him. I think next up would be Alice. Unlike Snow, Yurika basically is walking around with a sign and siren blaring her feelings for him right from when she literally runs into him. There's no real reason for this other than it mirrors her real-world self of viewing Alice as her soulmate since he's the first one she meets. Unlike in the original though, where Yurika had a reason for these feelings, this Yurika is just taken in by Alice's good looks and her own romantic notions about meeting her soulmate on the way to school like a rom-com. Alice, for his part, is his usual charming self, and we spend most of the route with him yelling glorious insults at everyone and being the king of Cinderies. While he mirrors his route with usually running away from her and her crazy aggressive overtures, he does eventually start showing he doesn't really mind being around her despite his protestations. I don't think I really get why Alice has fallen in love with Yurika in this world. His confession doesn't really clear anything up either, since it was like pulling teeth to get him to confess anyways. That being said though, Alice and Yurika's banter is always a fun time, and I did find it cute that he was the only one of the guys to beat her to the confession tree, and him being the one waiting for her at the end of the route. Plus, him practicing being taller than her by standing on a stair at the end and actually kissing her on the forehead, plus straightforwardly admitting his love for her without insult, was a nice surprise, and a great way to wrap up my time with this game. In a shocking turn of events, at number 3 is Mr. Wizard, who is not in first spot for a change. Not to say I didn't love this route, because I really did. He sure came out swinging with the big time plays for my heart. Him bridal carrying Yurika to the safety of the student council room during the culture festival for safety really got me, since I'm weak for that bridal carry, as you all know. And the kinda almost date with him where he shows her around the looking glass world and holds her hand through the forest was super cute, since it reminded me of the first time I held hands with my husband. Everything's looking good for the wizard up to this point. But then I start to notice a pattern. It's around now that the wizard starts acting a little funny, and I finally realize he's continuously trying to come up with different scenarios to encourage Yurika to spend time with any other guy but him. I actually really liked that because it was a nice parallel to his route in the original game, and without the weirdness of Yurika already being engaged to all of them at the same time. However, as time goes, it becomes very apparent that this wizard is still the one and the same that exists in every other universe, dreamland, timeline, what have you, and the Kuro with him is the same Yurika that became his cat in the original too. Based on what the wizard said, this seems to take place after his route, but before the end of the original game, since Kuro's still stuck in her number 2 position. And I personally liked that the reason he didn't return this Yurika's affections is not only because of him saying he's still obsessed with real-world Yurika at this point, but that even by now he's elevated Kuro over the other Yurikas, including this one. I think it showcases already how his heart and thoughts were changing towards his Yurika, and sets up nicely for his epilogue in this fandisk as well. And personally, I think it only adds extra meaning to him returning Cat Yurika's feelings in the end, knowing that he's already started to view all Yurikas as not being equal by rejecting this Arisa Academy one. I know not everyone will agree with my thoughts on this, but that's personally how I took it, and this is my review, so you can't stop me. However, all that having been said, because Wizard doesn't return this Yurika's affections, I can't really place him at the top of this list when there are other endings that are much better in the romance department, while also being really satisfying. Then at number 2, Professor Kaguya. This whole route was just full of callbacks to his original one, and I loved it. In addition to Kaguya being his usual romantic self, and giving out more of those wonderful head pats I love so much, my favorite callback had to be the love letter assignment he gave the class. The letter writing in the original was fantastic, and I was thrilled to see it brought back for this route as well. I also thought it was funny that he made our girl sweat a little bit too by saying he'd only let her know his feelings for her if she agreed to a Christmas date with him. Now, I figured that him inviting her on a date in the first place was pretty self-explanatory on its own without the letter, but thankfully Yurika was thick here, so we were treated to a wonderful date and then a lovely letter from him admitting that he does think of her as more than a student. Plus he hit both me and Yurika with the bombshell that he may not be around next year because he's only a substitute teacher. I felt so dumb for not recognizing the parallel of him leaving before that moment. It was such a clever way to incorporate him leaving for the moon from his original route. Thankfully, our boy didn't leave this time either, and it didn't require our girl to nearly kill herself to convince him to stay either. Shout out to Mom for being a hopeless romantic. And kudos to Kaguya for thinking to ask for permission to date Yurika under the circumstances. Of course, because it's Kaguya, we see some dark Kagubear obsession come out at the end with him, where he states to Yurika that he wants to become obsessed with her to the point that he can no longer function. But other than that, it was a very sweet ending, and I couldn't help but giggle like a silly schoolgirl when he broke the rules to steal a kiss from Yurika when no one was looking. Such a bad boy. However, I think the main reason this route didn't quite grab my number 1 is because while I love how flirty and romantic these two are with each other, it came across as a little odd this time around that it started off so strongly like that. While it made some kind of sense in the original since they were dating right from the beginning, here they're in very different roles, so it just didn't quite feel right to have that vibe right from the beginning. Other than that though, I really loved getting some more Kagubear goodness, and he's a solid number 2 for me here. Taking the number 1 spot as he rightfully deserves after all this time is Cinderella. He's been vying for that spot in my heart for ages, and he more than earned it in Arisa Academy. Obsession with the female students' legs aside, he is such a good guy. Yurika and Cinderella play off of each other here as well as they do in the original, and I felt like they had the most natural building of romantic feelings here as well. Her helping him with his work at school all the time was a great way for them to spend time together, and Cinderella always did his darndest to keep Yurika in check with some karate chops to the head when she got too aggressively flirty with him as a teacher. Aside from the time he accepted a massage from her, but I won't talk about that. I was so happy they kept Cinderella's love of glass making in this. making it his specialty as an art teacher, and that they even included glass-making lessons with Yurika here too, just like in the original story. Even his Christmas date was focused around seeing glass accessories, and I'll admit I was laughing at his discomfort when Yurika took her chance to have them pretend to be boyfriend and girlfriend. Him being bullied into buying a bracelet for her afterwards by the sales clerk was so on brand for him as well. But what really cinched Cinderella as number one was the way the confession tree scene was handled with him. Despite everyone in this universe throwing this boy under the bus for being irresponsible and a bad example as a teacher, he's actually the best out of all of them, because despite him falling for Yurika through the year, he didn't allow himself to respond to her confession right away the first time around. He was super responsible and mature in the way he handled her confession, by giving the honest truth that it wouldn't be appropriate for him as a teacher to be dating his student, and that he wants her to spend her last year at school not focused on him and giving herself the opportunity to potentially date a fellow student. But then he follows up with saying if she feels the same way a year from now, that he'll give her his honest answer to her confession. And true to his word, 12 months later, to the minute, probably, he beats Yurika to the punch and invites her to the tree this time around, and comes out swinging with what is probably the best confession out of all the guys. Boy even told her he wants to marry her one day. It was just all so wonderful. Because these two waited the whole year and still felt the same way about each other also makes me feel they have the highest chance of staying together out of everyone else. It was just such a beautiful ending for a beautiful man, and I'm thrilled to give the number one spot to him here. So there you have it, my final 3 lists, which means it's time for the bonus awards section. Best new outfit of the guys has to go to Cinderella in Arisa Academy. I was unprepared for it being possible for that man to get any more attractive, and all I can say is Professor Cinderella can get it anytime. Next award is for favorite CG. This was a difficult one because there were so many gorgeous ones, so I decided to cheat a little and do one for each of the sections in this fan disc. For the epilogues, my favorite one is definitely Snow and Yurika at the piano. The lighting in that one is so eerie and beautiful. For the Woolfe and Ryoushi routes, the one of Alistair and Wolf with their hands outstretched towards Yurika in the Prince and the Wolf ending is absolutely my favorite. The lighting in that is just gorgeous, and it has 2 of my favorite boys in it. And finally, for Arisa Academy, I have to go with the last one of Cinderella's where he's hugging her from behind. The sparkles on the sunlight coming through the tree really give it a fairy tale feel. As for favorite kiss CG, you get 3 guesses which one's my favorite, and the first 2 guesses don't count, because obviously I'm giving it to the wizard in his epilogue. The funniest scene award goes to Kaguya's psychic mind reading when Yurika was sick, and zooming back into the room over and over every time he left the room. That was hilarious. Favorite wolf daydream goes to the one where he walks in on Wizard and Yurika's heavy petting. I still can't believe Yurika told Wolf straight up in that fantasy he was the only one she wasn't sleeping with. I was deceased with that comment. Not to mention the first thing he says after the fantasy is over is goddamn thirsty nympho slut. That was just too amazing. Favorite culture festival date goes to Kaguya. It was just a legitimately good time from beginning to end, with him trying to make it romantic throughout the day, and Yurika chastising him but secretly enjoying it all along. Favorite Christmas date also goes to Kaguya. I almost chose Cinderella, but unlike with him, Kaguya actually went into this as a real date, and Yurika was flustered basically from beginning to end, which was fun, so he ended up narrowly beating out Cinderella for this award. But speaking of Cinderella, my favorite confession in Arisa Academy has to go to him. So many I love yous were exchanged, and it was so heartfelt on both sides. Plus, he's already angling to marry this girl one day. I absolutely loved it. Favorite new sprite expression, and I'll be honest, I only made up this award so that I could give it to Alistair's 1000% done face. I first saw it in Wolf's second ending, and it is absolutely incredible. I had no idea Alistair was capable of such a face, and I love that expression so much. Favorite new background that got added here is the gym one in Wizard's Arisa Academy ending. The reason for that is really stupid because it's not that it looks nicer than the other ones. I just think it's hilarious that this background was only used once in the entire game, and it was just for 5 minutes. It was such an unnecessary background, and the fact that it only appears in Wizard's Root really tickles my funny bone, as it makes me think he conjured up an original background for himself to make his root more special than the other guys. And my final award goes to favorite piece of music here, which is a pretty easy one since I really only had 2 new ones to pick from, but I wanted to shout out Snow White's song once again because it was absolutely gorgeous. Snow White has the voice of an angel, and I could listen to that song for ages. And those are all the bonus awards I could come up with. I hope you enjoyed listening to my final thoughts on this topsy-turvy fandisk. Some of it was a grind, a lot of it was hilarious, and there were more than a few wholesome moments to tie it all together in a lovely bow. I for sure wouldn't recommend this game if you haven't played the original game, because you'd be so very lost with what is going on here. But if you have played through the original Taisho Alice, and enjoyed even a small part of it, and you're as crazy as me and wanted more, then I can fairly safely say that there'll be moments and stories you'll also love here in Heads and Tails. Alright, with that, I would love to hear from you guys as well, what your thoughts were, how your list or lists ended up looking. Also, if you have some bonus awards you'd like to share, then I would love to hear it. And with that, that is officially a wrap on both these series. Now, if you're on my Discord, then you already know what games are coming up already, but if you haven't heard, my next adventures will take place in Gilded Shadows and Bandcamp Boyfriend. It's sad to say goodbye to this world in Psychedelica, but at the same time, I'm definitely excited for 2 entirely new games. I hope you guys are as excited as I am for whatever shenanigans we're about to get into. Thanks again for watching, hope you enjoyed my final thoughts, and as always, until next time, I will see you later.